Hello everyone, welcome to Tabletop Forge. This is my first YouTube video ever, so thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoy it. I normally make a lot of D&D stuff for my D&D group, but for this first video I wanted to try something a little bit simpler, and I wanted to make a small display board for part of my Nurgle army. This army has been sitting on a shelf for far too long gathering dust, and I want to do it some justice and make a video for you here. So that's the plan, that's why we're here, that's what we're going to do. Thank you guys for tuning in. Let's do it. There are a few things I'm going to use for this build that were not scratch built, such as this temple entrance that was 3D printed for me by a friend. I painted it up, but I didn't really like the scale for the project I was working on, so I just kind of put it to the side, and now I'm going to try to use it. My main idea is to build kind of an ancient temple that was corrupted by the forces of Nurgle. And so I cut some pink XPS foam, I set up a general layout of what I thought it would look like, and I went from there. In one of the books I have on Nurgle, it talks about when they encounter temples and shrines to other deities, they desecrate them with muck and mire. My sort of vision here is to build this ancient temple as something that's been corrupted by Nurgle, and now they're using it as a kind of a focus of their power to spread rot throughout the land and do bad Nurgly things. Here I'm going to start carving in some stone tiles for the inner floor of this temple. I start with kind of a thin line of tile so it'll help blend in better with the bricks that are already there on the 3D printed piece. And then I just carved in some regular squares for the rest. Here I took a little tile basically and cut off the corners so that I can use it as a stencil to kind of carve in some decorative corner pieces so that these don't just look like boring square tiles. Then I go over these lines with an X-Acto knife and a ballpoint pen to widen them and give them some more definition. I also make sure to go around the side of this piece and kind of just continue the tiles on the sides and the back and the front, just to make it look a little bit more real and give it a little bit more character. And in the front part of the foam here, I'll carve in some bricks to help it blend in with the rest of the temple. Here our goal is to turn this flat, boring pink foam into something that's less flat and boring by pressing a rock into the foam to create some texture. So make it look a little bit more like stone, and it'll give it some places where the black wash later can give it some shadow and the dry brushing can give it some highlight. I also want to kind of texture the edges with a little bit of sandpaper so they don't look so, clean cut, and also continue this texture around the front so that it all looks uniform and made out of the same stuff. Another thing we can do to make the tiles look a little bit more real is to take a sharp X-Acto knife and kind of cut some corners and a bit out of the edge of some of the tiles. This will make it look a little bit more 3D, make it look like the tiles are maybe worn or crushed maybe on the corners. Just give it a little bit more realism and character. And the last thing I like to do with some of the tiles is to kind of trace out the complete tile with a knife and then press it in with the back of the knife to make it look like it's sunken or crushed. And I go through and do this on a few tiles, and then finally I have the finished textured tile floor of our temple. The last thing to do before we throw on some paint is to fill this little gap between the 3D printed temple entrance and our pink foam tiles with a little bit of spackling paste and a sculpting tool. Once I have the gap filled, it's pretty easy to clean up the rest with a wet paintbrush. Outside the temple, I want to build a rough kind of flagstone pathway. So I'm taking some old dollar store foam board, cutting out some squares and rectangles, and getting a rough placement of where they should be. Once I have a rough fit that I like, I'm ready to glue them down using some Mod Podge. Here I like to just take each stone, dip it in the Mod Podge, and press it into place. This gives you some working time before the glue dries, so you can kind of go back and readjust the pieces and make sure everything looks just the way you want. These don't need to be perfect, as we're going to cover them with some Sculptamold and some texture later, so some of it will be covered, some of it will be obscured. We just need a rough fit that looks somewhat reasonable. Some quick texture with an aluminum foil ball and a rock, and we have ourselves some flagstones. Let's change gears a little bit to make something gross. I have some plumber's epoxy here, which is like green stuff, a 2-part epoxy, and I want to make it into some buboes, some blisters, some pustules. I don't know what exactly to call them, but some kind of physical manifestation of Nurgle's disgusting disease. I use a sculpting tool for the basic shape, and then I use the top of a brush to press in some circles. And then I'll use some sculpting tools to press in some gross little holes in the main bubo part, I guess. And another sculpting tool to just carve in some texture around the edge. This is my first time doing something like this with plumber's epoxy. Just happened to have this lying around. It's pretty old and it didn't really mix very well, so it's not a great choice. I think green stuff is still better. But I did make 4 of these out of the plumber's epoxy, and later I make a few more with green stuff, and I think they turned out pretty good and pretty gross. Next, we're going to mix up some Sculptamold, some glue, paint, and water, and we're going to rub it into our piece to create some ground texture. I wanted to sort of cover all these flagstones and still have them showing out. I wanted to fill all the gaps between our temple entrance and the foam, and here using water to kind of smooth it out and to really help get the definition of the stones. It's pretty useful, so I would recommend it if you're working with this kind of stuff. And as that's drying, or when it's mostly dried, I'm going to take some black paint, Mod Podge, and water and cover all the foam bits with that as a sort of paint primer, but also the Mod Podge helps kind of strengthen the foam and give it some durability. We'll add some watered down gray paint to bring out the flagstones. And I'm hoping I can match the paint job I did on this temple entrance a while ago. Ends up I did pick the right choices. This is kind of some kind of beige color, and I'm going over it and carrying it over a little bit to the temple entrance. Throwing some brown, watered down brown paint to cover up the Sculptamold areas. I do put paint in the Sculptamold, but it's so white that I feel like it always just flattens out the paint a lot, so I end up going over it anyways. And finally, adding a dry brush to these tiles is the step that sort of starts to bring this piece together, starts to create the illusion that the 3D printed plastic and the pink foam are actually made of the same material and make up this temple. And I'll continue the dry brush around the front of the temple and use it to clean up some spots where some of the Sculptamold got onto these steps. And of course the flagstones get a little dry brushing too. And to add a little bit of color to the piece, I'm going to take some watered down navy blue paint and color in these little corner pieces, these little kind of diamond sections on the temple entrance floor. And I water it down so it's not too strong, and then obviously I'm going to go over it with the dry brushing later, and it'll help kind of blend it in, make it look nice and weathered and not too bold. Oh yeah, somewhere in here I covered everything in a black wash to give it some shadow, but I lost footage of that, so there you go. Finally, the dry brush to wrap up the paint on the temple floor, and then that part is pretty much done. Here's the other piece that I'm not making from scratch. I have these old trees I made on a project probably like 10 years ago, and I ended up scrapping the project a while ago because I was just carrying it around, but now I have these trees that I want to repurpose. So first thing I should have done is clean off these mold lines of these tree armatures to make them look a little bit better, a little bit more realistic. And also I kind of hate the color on these, so I took some this like a chestnut color, watered down, and covered it to give it a little bit more, I don't know, of a natural look, or at least not just a grayish brown plastic look. And the last thing I want to do is kind of spice up the foliage, and I didn't want to have to take it off, so instead I'm going to add to it. I'm going to take this spray adhesive, some of these leaf scatter foam bits, and I took the tree outside and sprayed it with the spray adhesive, and then I'm just sprinkling some of these little leaves on the top, and this is going to give it a little bit of a highlight, a little bit of texture. It's very similar to the color that's already there, but it still kind of stands out and makes it look a little bit more realistic than it did. And I think that was a good compromise to not ripping off the flocking or the foam and doing it all from scratch. It was pretty quick and easy, and the final result here on these trees I think is much better than what it looked like before. Time to paint some buboes. I love these speed paints from Army Painter. This is just orc skin green, I think, and I'm going to use that to just go around the outer part of these buboes, and then I'm going to use a yellow to do the inside part. And that's pretty much it. I do think this green is a little bit strong on its own, so to tone it down a little bit, I'm going to take another color, this Nurgling green, and I'm going to dry brush the green part to try to tone it down a little bit. And I think that'll give it a little bit of a highlight and also make it a little bit less bold and green. These are the other ones that I ended up making out of green stuff, as you can see, and I think they blend in pretty well with the others, and can't really tell which one's made of what. Both good materials. And here comes the real bold move. Nurgle's rot spreads from his places of power, and I wanted to try to show that not just with the buboes, not just with the flocking later, but I wanted some veins of rot to be coming out of this temple, and I wasn't sure how to go about this exactly. I wanted it to be nice and low profile so that you could still put miniatures on it, and I figured hot glue is always a fun thing to work with, so here I am just basically trying to make this look like veins coming out of the temple, but in hot glue. And it's a little bit scary to do this because obviously I'm covering work that I already did, and if I try to remove it, you know, some of it will be okay to remove, but not all of it. Some of it could tear up the paint. But I went for it, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Once I have all of the glue out there, I actually I don't have it on camera, but I take the nozzle of the hot glue gun while it's still hot, and I sort of rub it or scratch it onto the hot glue, and it creates a texture that looks sort of veiny and gross. I wasn't sure what to do for the color here, but I do have this Nurgle rot, which is perfect because that's literally what I'm trying to do. And this stuff already has kind of a shine to it, and it's a little bit transparent. So I figured I'd just sort of glob it onto all the hot glue and try to get some good coverage. And it worked out pretty well. Sometimes getting paint to stick to hot glue can be really tough, so this special little Nurgle's rot paint really worked out. Now it's time to add some ground cover to this piece. I'm going to start with some basic like play sand you can get from Home Depot. I have some watered down white glue that I'm going to use to kind of fill in some of these cracks up against the base of the foam and the base of the temple, and also kind of around the steps, maybe some sporadic parts out around the flagstones. And I'll just cover it with glue, sprinkle in the sand, and that'll give me some very basic ground cover that I can start to build on. Next I have a secret ingredient. It's Italian style herb, and I'm just going to use this for the base of the trees to create some dead leaves. For the actual flocking and the grass, I love this color blended turf. I'm going to use that closer to the temple entrance because it's going to simulate some like dead corrupted grass or earth. And then for the kind of latter part, I'm going to use just a regular green, and I'm going to try to blend the two together. Again, one of the themes here is sort of the rot spreading from the temple outwards, so you'll see that as obviously the veins and buboes, the color of the grass, and then later I actually add some grass tufts that also have two different colors, kind of based on how close they are to the temple entrance. I want to get pretty good covering here, and I'm not afraid to put some of this over the flagstones that are there. Later I'll brush off some so that I can, make sure I can see them, but also this is supposed to look a little bit overgrown, so it's okay if some of the corners or even some of the stones are covered with this flocking. I think it makes it look a little bit more realistic. Once I have it all in place and I'm ready to seal it, I'm going to first spray it with some watered down isopropyl alcohol so that everything seeps in, and then I took some watered down white glue in a little kind of paint thing and I dropped it on there. This was a little bit nerve-wracking because I don't know if it was the alcohol or the glue, but the green flock, kind of some of the green seeped out of it, but once it dried you couldn't really notice. It looked pretty good. Right here I have the grass tufts already placed roughly in their positions, and then I'm going to go ahead and glue them in so that they stay in those positions. Always try to dry fit things when I can, and then glue them when I'm happy with how they're placed. Here's the look of the outside ground, and at this point I am feeling pretty elated because it's almost done. There's literally one step left to do. And here it is. I'm going to take some tacky glue, and where I decided the trees are going to be, I'm going to place it there and pop the trees in those holes. Guys, this video has taken me quite a while to make and to edit since it's my first time doing so. So if you like this video or you want to subscribe, please do those things. If you want to leave me any constructive criticism in the comments, I bet I could use it, so I'd appreciate that as well. And this last shot here was brought to you by Eileen's Tacky Glue. There it is, episode 1 of Tabletop Forge done. Nurgle display board done. No longer will my Forces of Nurgle be sitting on a dusty shelf. Honestly, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this. Hopefully you have a new way to spread Nurgle's rot on your gaming table. And thank you all for tuning in. There's more videos coming. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next time on Tabletop Forge.